In 2009, a sociology graduate student at the University of Missouri made a decision that would ultimately change how we understand modern media. While Twitter was still seen by many as a trivial platform for sharing what you had for breakfast, this researcher saw something different. They saw the future of journalism, democracy, and information itself being rewritten in 280 characters. Today, as misinformation spreads faster than wildfire and the lines between citizen and professional journalists blur beyond recognition, this researcher was there, taking notes, as our information landscape transformed forever. From PHI Media, I'm Gordon Thane, and joining me for a conversation is someone who spent nearly a decade studying Twitter before it became the informational battleground that we now know today, whose book, Citizens at the Gate, documented the collapse of traditional media gatekeeping, and whose latest work examines how problematic information flows through our digital world. Dr. Stephen Barnard. You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content. Dr. Barnard, welcome to the Public Health Insight Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Gordon.
I was talking to you off air about how misinformation has evolved a lot over the century or centuries perhaps, and probably even more accelerated over the last 5-6 years for various reasons that we'll talk about. And so you're someone that comes in with that expertise who has studied the platform like Twitter before it became this behemoth vehicle that it is now, and people have lots of thoughts and feelings about that. But before you were this sociologist, researcher, professor person, you had a normal life with interests, and I wanted to take us back to those days of you being a high school newspaper editor, why you decided to do that, and then take us to that period of life that you went through, that transition from high school to university, how your interests were evolving at the time, what program you chose to study, why you chose to study that program.
Wow. Thanks for the opportunity. I think it's pretty humbling to think back to sort of our youth and where I was in particular. I won't say exactly how many years ago, but plenty of years ago. When I was a high school student, I was really interested in technology and generally speaking, and media, in part mostly as a consumer. I was motivated by my parents to take every technology class that my school had. And so I was a bit technologically inclined of various sorts, but I also just kind of stumbled into a class on journalism. And I found myself realizing that the photojournalism aspect was not necessarily my strongest skill, but that I was a decent writer and I enjoyed writing. And after the class, I thought, well, maybe that's something I'll participate in. And so I joined the staff and was mostly writing. I wasn't doing any hard-hitting important news stories. I don't think I was even doing much substantive journalism, even of the local environment. I was mostly, doing feature pieces, and I had a column about the local car scene and very sort of simple, fun stuff. But the other role I had later on in those years was as a business editor, sort of the manager, business side of the newspaper. So I was on the editorial staff and helped with layout, sold ads, but really just ran the business sides of the newspaper. And that taught me a lot about just kind of how the economics of a very small subsidized paper from the school can run, but a very simple form of now what I later ended up understanding is happening in the news business more broadly. But it also taught me about just what a fun challenge writing nonfiction was like, and just kind of what the culture of a of a bunch of high schoolers might create in a newsroom, which I know is very different than the professional side. So I ended up a couple of years later, I'm from Missouri in the United States, and a few hours away from the University of Missouri, where one of the world's oldest and still one of the best journalism schools exists at the University of Missouri. And so I went there. I ended up taking an early journalism class, but at the time, it didn't spark me as a professional interest. And I was a business major. I think my goal at that time, if if you were to ask me as a 19-year-old kid what I wanted to do, I would say I wanted to be successful. I didn't know what that looked like.
Right.
And I really didn't realize I did not like what I was studying in particular. I wasn't passionate about what I was studying.
Right.
And this is, no slight on any discipline or interest.
Right.
It's just I didn't realize, it didn't speak to me in any particular way. But I was basically eavesdropping over some neighbors in a management class or something, and they were talking about a sociology class on organizations and institutions, and it was just before time to enroll for the next semester. And so I jotted down something in my notebook about that and went to register for the course. And the system apparently was supposed to keep me out because of prerequisites, but the system didn't function properly. I learned later.
You got it because of a good.
I learned this later, but it let me in the course, and it was an upper level course, which is why I apparently, as never taking an intro sociology course, I shouldn't have been allowed to take it. But that course changed my life, really. It was a pretty critical look at so many different institutions and organizations across society, and it really opened my eyes to the way that the world worked. I think I was in many ways kind of sheltered or just kind of living in my own little world with some blinders on about the variety of social issues and social problems that existed. And that class, for myself, kind of embarrassing as a 19, 20-year-old kid, that was really mostly news to me and really kind of an intoxicating experience. And so within a couple of months of taking that class, I remember I used to go to the professor's office hours every week. I just sit there and we would talk. And I ended up having this kind of quarter life crisis where I was talking to my close friends and family members about this experience. And I kind of found myself stuck at a crossroads. It's like, at the time, the popular film The Matrix had just come out, which is ironic now because the people who I sometimes study use this as a way to sort of feed propaganda, the sort of red pill, blue pill metaphor. But I very much thought of it that way. It was like, should I take the red pill and basically, for me, that meant changing my major to sociology. I was, I think, a rising junior, and so that would mean maybe even delaying my graduation date a little bit. But for me, the goal was to find a life that I would be happy living. So the goal was, at that point, if I was going to change my major to sociology, I knew at that moment that I wasn't just going to take a couple extra years. My goal was, I want to be a sociologist professionally, which means I want to go get a PhD. I want to be a professor. And so apparently I'm an all or nothing person. So I was like, I'm going to go all in on this, or I'm going to take the blue pill and act like this never happened, go back to my major and basically stay on the path that I was on. And I really spent about a month or so in limbo, really kind of struggling with what to do about that. Well, it's clear at this point what my choice was, which was maybe a pretty bold move at that time, to take on more debt and more time in school and to spend another decade in school studying sociology, and ended up focusing a lot on media specifically and working in some capacities at the Mizzou Journalism School as a part of that. But yeah, I ended up doing 3 degrees in sociology and really had a huge positive impact on my life, that moment in time.
So when you said that you knew that when you made that decision, you'd follow it all the way through, were there other options that you considered within the lane of sociology? Being a professor is kind of one thing, and there's things outside of that. Did that come from you wanting to play a role in sort of researching and building the knowledge and evidence in sociology? Or is that more out of, this is probably the only lane I knew at the time that I would be able to get once I got my PhD?
There's definitely other opportunities. I mean, now as a professor, as an advisor, I see students go on to all different sorts of careers. Some of them in public health, others in justice and in reform, in all across the business sector, certainly in social work and other health adjacent fields. There are many, many pathways that students can take. I didn't even do justice to it there with a few examples. But at the time, so it wasn't as if there wouldn't be other options to me. I knew that I was really passionate about the creation and of knowledge and ideas and the research side of it. I wanted to be more involved in that. And so I just thought, and I think I was afraid that if I I knew that my passion really was there. And I think I was afraid that if I finished school and went off into a job, then I would, get distracted by life and by the day-to-day and wouldn't go back to school. And so I basically told myself that if I was going to make that change, I was gonna bite off the whole thing and invest in that journey. And I'm glad I did, but it certainly had its bumps along the way.
Now, speaking of research, I believe your dissertation for your PhD focused on Twitter and the journalistic field. Mm-hmm. What's the story behind, looking at the dates? I was trying to do some chronology. Twitter was launched in about 2006, I believe. Your dissertation published in about 2012, so you would have obviously had to have been looking at it even prior. So that was pretty early on where it wasn't at the scale that it exists now. Like, why did you specifically hone in on Twitter?
Yeah, fun to sort of think back about some of this stuff. For me, Twitter just kind of fell into my lap. Again, I was interested in technology. I was very much interested in media. I spent a number of my early undergraduate and early graduate years participating and conducting a few different studies on media of various sorts. I was really thinking that my dissertation was going to be about what I perceived to be shifts in and maybe a decline in investigative journalism, and in particular in the US. And in part, that had a lot to do with the fact that you were just kind of seeing less hard-hitting news, the kind of post-Watergate era, as it's sometimes talked about in US history, where there was all these scandals happening at the highest levels of government, and we had kind of enterprising reporters really digging into those things and helping the public kind of move past some really difficult times. It felt like there were lots of other problems that we were not getting as much critical help from the media through. And I was also at the University of Missouri, where they happened to, the Investigative Reporters and Editors, IRE organization, is housed there, and they have a huge archive that goes back along many, many years about investigative journalism. And so I thought, well, that would be a good resource. Maybe I'll study that. And I was trained in historical sociological methods in part, and so I thought that might be a good project. But then by the time I was sort of sitting down to plan out what a dissertation would look like and to officially propose it, Twitter was making a huge splash in the news industry, both in terms of just how news was spreading to the public, but also how media professionals were communicating, collecting news, sharing it, talking about their profession with their peers. It was kind of like the digital water cooler. And so I basically joined Twitter in early 2009 with the goal of just trying to see what was there and to see if that really was something to study. And I ended up doing 8 years of participant observation. The first number of those, of course, were leading up to the conclusion and defense of my dissertation. And then I basically continued on that research up through 2016 or 2017 as I was finishing what ultimately became my first book.
Let's talk about your first book. Sort of a sequel, I guess, to the dissertation. So how did this extra 6 years or so that you did on top of your PhD dissertation, how did that evolve maybe your thoughts and perspectives on what you learned about Twitter?
Yeah, well, obviously the story didn't stop when I graduated, right?
Yeah.
So the news cycle was still playing out. I'd started out that study thinking about just the role that Twitter was playing in journalism for journalism professionals and maybe sort of citizens who were participating in the sharing of news and the creation of news to some degree. At the time, that was often talked about as this phenomenon that sometimes is referred to as citizen journalism. And so I was focusing a bit on that. And the reason I titled the book, ultimately ended up titling what became the book, Citizens at the Gates, because I wanted to highlight the ways that the professional side of journalism had lost some control over the traditional gatekeeping process, the control of information, the sharing of it with the public, and sort of looking more at how that gatekeeping process was being controlled, not wholly, but more than ever before, by other types of new media platforms, and also by the people that ended up that researchers sometimes refer to as the networked public. And so, yeah, I ended up looking at certainly how reporters were using Twitter, both in terms of their day-to-day kind of practices and in some case studies, looking at how their norms of the profession were changing, especially in the US. But then I was also looking at case studies like the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, I believe, which had a lot of kind of collaborative journalism between professionals and citizens. I was looking at the aftermath, the ongoing and after the protests for Black Lives Matter after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, which is not far from where I grew up. And then, of course, the election of Donald Trump happened, and I had basically thought I had finished the book, and then my editor said, actually, there's maybe another chapter that needs to be in this book, and because that was sort of happening at that time. And I was convinced pretty quickly that that was an important sort of continuation of the phenomenon. So I ended up looking there at how political actors, whether it's Trump himself or other journalists and citizens who were either supporting or being critical of him, and how that sort of shaped the flow of information through the media ecosystem.
I want to go back to how you explained the evolution of journalism and how, kind of anybody with a phone, internet, and a Twitter account can effectively do some level of journalistic work. Would an example of that be, I see something happening in my ear that's potentially newsworthy. I kind of put it up on Twitter, and effectively I'm beating a journalist to what they would have traditionally came and covered and broke the news first. Is that kind of one example of how that's played out?
That's right. I mean, certainly, I think some of the protests were a really good example of this, right? And certainly each of some of those cases illustrated different aspects of that. But if we think about, let's say, Black Lives Matter protests, there's incidents happening. There's a lot of sort of research in sociology and related fields about some of the trends of news media coverage of protests. And they tend to fall along a pretty stereotypical line where they highlight the supposed violence of protesters. They sort of adopt the frame of the police and the state-based institutions, and they kind of, you can turn on cable television news and they sort of often embody this very well, and they sort of stereotypically cover things in ways that don't necessarily get at the nuances. You don't actually hear protesters saying what their concerns or demands or what have you are, and instead just kind of doing the spectacle kind of frame of the news. And I'll say that that's not necessarily true for all of the reporters who were on the ground, because oftentimes what I saw, let's say, in the case studies of Ferguson, one of the chapters in that book looks at both a cohort of journalists who were covering those protests, often from on the ground. And so they would be, sort of live tweeting their experiences on the ground with photos and videos or live streams as well. But a lot of those tools were also accessible to people who were showing up to the protests without a professional motivation to be there. And so they were there for their own, usually social justice-oriented reasons, but they were doing a lot of that same work. And so in some ways I was, I think, somewhat surprised to find that a lot of the tactics being used were quite similar. There was a lot of just sort of saying updates, we're going here, or the police are tear gassing journalists here, and police are using these pretty aggressive tactics against protesters in various ways. That didn't get as much attention on the local news, and it was harder to get through some of the more mainstream channels, but was just kind of a way for people to share their voice without having to go through the sort of gates of the traditional media. And they could use those channels to shape the way that traditional media cover those things. Trump was a great example of that, right? He would post something on Twitter. Not only might people just go directly to his feed to read those things, but reporters would use those things to then sort of amplify his message through their own more mainstream channels. And so they weren't necessarily one or the other, but it was a way for citizens and professionals alike to simply sort of share news. And sometimes, as you were saying, that means that they might actually scoop the reporters and get information out there before it's able to sort of hit the mainstream channel.
And then that kind of now feeds into that instant gratification type of and then you sort of talked about the death of investigative journalism, the getting breaking news as quickly as possible seems to be the now in vogue thing versus the kind of more detailed methodological investigative journalism on some of these issues that we like. It feels like almost that's where the nuance gets lost a little bit, where it's kind of speed over precision, and that can kind of cost you time.
Yeah, I think what you just said there is quite right. I wouldn't say that investigative journalism has died, because there's still plenty of good investigative reporting taking place, but by and large, it is expensive and time consuming and it sometimes requires years of information requests through government organizations and a lot of digging and investment of resources, and the news business has had their own share of challenges and crises, for that matter, that have really upended or made it more difficult for them to sustain the business of journalism. And so the cheaper, lower-hanging fruit is much easier to do, and that's perhaps it's a good example of why we maybe see snippets from social media on the news, is because those can be pulled in a matter of minutes and then talked about in ways that might seem current and interesting and newsy to some degree, but are much cheaper to produce.
Now, I want to take us back to, so obviously you have a career in academia, researcher, sociologist. You mentioned a little bit earlier about your students go on to play many different types of roles in society, bringing their expertise. I think you've been at the University of Denver, St. Lawrence, and then now at Butler, probably many connections to other universities as well. What are some of your favorite courses to teach, how students respond, and the biggest things you've learned from not just maybe the research side of things, where you build the scientific knowledge that we have, but also that interaction between students and how you're on their journeys with them as learners too. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I've always been inclined toward teaching, and I've really been very fortunate to work with some wonderful students and colleagues. The students really are the reason why this profession for me is, I think, as fulfilling as it has been, and I hope continues to be. I have the privilege to teach a lot of fun and interesting classes as someone who teaches about and who studies things that are somewhat related to current issues. And if we think about media and technology as kind of things that are constantly evolving, they're also kind of part of people's, especially young people's, everyday lives. And so it's something that people come in with a fair bit of interest and experience in, even if they don't have the kind of sociological or a more academic perspective on it. They have experiential knowledge about these issues, and so that's a fun starting point for us to talk about a variety of things. And so over my career, I've taught a lot of different courses about those topics. Some on kind of digital culture and identity. In the past, I used to teach a course that was basically like, is the internet good or bad for democracy? Yes. We spend half the time looking at the way that digital technologies can be used for social change and social movements, and also how they're used for surveillance and control of democratic and justice-oriented groups. Those types of conversations are fun. I mean, I've led research seminars where we dig into Twitter data and we collect and analyze it together and kind of do some of that research collaboratively. And some of those things actually led to some of the projects that were included in my first book. So those types of things have been a lot of fun. I still teach about some of those issues. At Butler now I teach sometimes a class about surveillance. I teach a course on violence in media and culture. I teach about theory, which is kind of just more traditional sociology, but kind of thinking conceptually and historically about the way that social issues and institutions may shape people's experiences. All of those things are really exciting to deal with in a classroom where where students, again, have their own experiences, have their own knowledge and ideas. And so they get to push me to think about things from perspectives maybe that I haven't yet confronted or considered in the same way. And vice versa. I get to kind of sometimes historicize these things for them, and other times just kind of share perspectives about how these issues are kind of happening on the back end. Because, you know, as we pick up our phones and open up an app and sort of experience the flow of information through an algorithm, that's not the same thing as kind of having a critical understanding of what makes those platforms work and what are some of the factors that drive them. And so those are fun conversations to have.
Agree. I wish I was able to take one of those classes. All right. So are you ready for our rapid fire Insight Blitz segment?
I think so.
You ready? Okay.
I'm
so
ready.
I'm going to ask you some questions or read some statements, and then you'll give a brief reaction or brief response. Ready?
Ready.
All right. True or false? All media are social.
True. It's the title of my second co-authored book, which is kind of a fun play on words, we think. But you know, obviously the phrase social media suggests that there's a particular type of media. And our kind of basic claim in that book is that there's a social history and a social element to the oldest forms of media. So true.
All right. So the media, or the type of media that has the potential to do the most harm in the current era that we're in.
Wow. I would say the media that has the largest following, the largest audience, and the least controls. So we could say that journalism organizations have a large following, maybe the largest following, but they also have controls, a professional culture, an ethics sort of guideline, and all of these things that sort of lead them toward truth at its core. But the further people get away from commitment to truth, and the greater amount of attention and audience that they reach, I'd say the more dangerous thing.
All right.
Potentially.
You're hosting a dinner party with your personal heroes. There are 3 seats. Your seat is number 4. Who else is at the table?
Oh, wow. That's a hard question. I would say, I think I'd have to choose some pretty classic historic figures. I mean, I'd love to have like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King there. I think those would be 2 people that are going to have a lot to say about a lot of important issues, and to historicize them in meaningful ways. Who's a third interesting person I'd want to add to that mix?
I think those 2. I think you're going to need more than dinner with those 2. So I think you got your hands full with those 2.
Okay. Yeah. I think I'll stick with that.
When you got those 2, you don't need the 3rd seat. So you could find
fair point.
You could find someone else another time. A hot take that you have about the work that you do that might ruffle some feathers, but you feel like you want to stick by it.
And this is a hot take with students. I don't know if it's a hot take with researchers, that researching media and social media in particular is harder than it looks. In some of my previous positions, I used to joke that I was the dream crusher, because students would come to me from across campus and want some help with a research project with social media data.
Right,
and I would ask them how they're getting access to that data. Do they have the coding skills or the financial backing to purchase those data, or whether or not those data are even accessible at scale? And so I think in general, and that just became, in many ways, that still is a conversation I have with students as they're aspiring to participate in research, is to sort of just peel back the curtain a little bit on some of the process that goes into collecting and analyzing digital data. It's more complicated than it looks.
I bet. Lastly, what's the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten?
I mean, I think in general, some people have told you, well, anytime people are giving advice from their perspective and aren't listening necessarily to you and where you're coming from, what might work for one person isn't necessarily going to be right for another. So, I mean, I think I can think of a few sort of minor times where people's perspective, as well-intentioned as they are, let's say in graduate school, to take this course or to avoid this person or to not trust this person. Sometimes people are stuck fighting the last war or their own battles, and sometimes that baggage can be weighted on other people's shoulders when really it maybe shouldn't be. And what's true for one person may be starkly different than their experience and fit with them. And I can't think of anything concretely, but there's a number of similar aspects of that, where people maybe meant well, but it didn't end up helping me with their insight there.
Take it with a grain of salt.
Sometimes you have to.
So that brings us to the end. That wasn't too bad. Did I scare you away? You going to stay with us for the rest of it?
No, I think so. And hopefully some answers will get better than those. But yeah, I'm in for the long haul.
What started as academic curiosity about Twitter's role in journalism has revealed itself as urgent research into the very foundations of truth in democratic society. When everybody becomes a publisher and the algorithm decides what we see, the old rules simply don't apply anymore. Coming up next, we'll explore how the same platforms that democratized information have become vectors for falsehoods. We'll examine why misinformation isn't just a media problem, it's a public health crisis. That's next time on the Public Health Insight Podcast. This show was edited by me, Gordon Thane, with additional editing from LaShawn Benedict. Sound design and mixing by myself and LaShawn Benedict. The original music from The Music Room, composed by Tom Fox, licensed from Johnny Harris. The cover art design for our show by LaShawn Benedict. The Public Health Insight Podcast is produced by PHI Media. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.